So thank you all so much for coming. I'm Doug Brake with ITIF, Telecom Policy Analyst here at ITIF. And welcome to the newly renovated and expanded ITIF offices. I think this is just our second event with our hopefully new glass panes here. So ITIF is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and educational institution that promotes public policies to advance technological innovation and productivity. Broadband is unquestionably today's key platform for innovation and productivity. And as we move forward in the 21st century, the extensive digitization of our economy will increasingly expect everyone to be online. Unfortunately, today that is not the case. Conversations about the digital divide were long dominated by the issue of broadband availability. But even after our networks have matured, adoption rates remain comparatively low. Recent data puts availability of broadband of at least 25 megabits per second available to 82% of U.S. households, while adoption has held steady at about 67 to 68%. The data suggests that the primary driver is not access to wires, but something else. John Horrigan's recent research indicates that low levels of digital literacy may be to blame. We've gathered a panel of distinguished experts to discuss John's recent research and to explore these issues. I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists. We've got much longer bios available online if everyone's interested. So John Horrigan. John's an independent communications and technology policy consultant. Horrigan's work focuses on consumer adoption and use of information and communications technologies. Horrigan previously worked as vice president and director of the Media and Technology Institute at the Joint Center, studying how emerging communications technologies can become avenues of advancement for the disadvantaged. Before joining the Joint Center, Horrigan was part of the FCC's National Broadband Plan, developing the research agenda for the inclusion portion of the plan. He also designed and conducted the FCC's first national survey on broadband adoption and usage. We also have Laura Breeden. Laura Breeden leads the NTIA's Public Computing and Sustainable Broadband Adoption components of the Recovery Act's $4.7 billion Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, better known as BTOP. In addition to subsidizing broadband infrastructure, BTOP makes public access computer centers and training available to vulnerable populations and promotes broadband adoption to groups that are underrepresented among broadband subscribers. Under her leadership, BTOP awarded more than $450 million for projects to make 21st century computer and internet services more available, affordable, and useful. We also have Laura Clark. Laura Clark is a program director at American Libraries Association Office for Information Technology Policy. Her responsibilities include overall management of their telecommunications portfolio, strategic communications and research, and day-to-day management of projects in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Previously, Laura served as the project manager in the ALA Office for Research and Statistics, where she coordinated the Public Library Funding and Technology Access Study. We have Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. Nicole is Vice President and Chief Research and Policy Officer for the Minority Media and Telecommunications Council. Prior to joining MMTC, Dr. Turner-Lee was Vice President and the first Director of the Media and Technology Institute for the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, one of the nation's leading research and public policy institutions, whose work focuses on issues of concern to African Americans and other people of color. During her tenure, Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee created the very first national minority broadband adoption study. And last but not least, we have Scott Walston. Scott is Vice President for Research and a Senior Fellow at the Technology Policy Institute, an economist with expertise in industrial organization and public policy. Scott's research focuses on telecommunication, regulation, competition, and technology policy. Walston is also a Senior Fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy and a lecturer in public policy at Stanford University. He served as economics director of the Federal Communications Broadband Task Force. So just a few words on format. We're going to first have John present the report and go through a number of slides looking at some of the data that he's uncovered, its implications, and his policy recommendation. Then we'll just sort of go down the line and have everyone present their reactions, their take, and their institution's take on the issues of broadband adoption, digital literacy, and digital readiness. And then I'll guide sort of a more informal discussion and then questions from the audience. So be thinking of your questions now. We're also live streaming the event, and we'll be taking questions by Twitter. Our hashtag is Digital Readiness. So anyone out there in the tweetosphere, feel free to send questions in that direction. With that, I'll turn it over to John to present the report.
Yep. Thanks very much, Doug. And let me start out my remarks by really giving a heartfelt thanks to ITIF and Doug and Alex and Bethany and others on the team here for letting me talk about these issues here today. I'm just an independent researcher trying to put some new ideas out there, and ITIF has been just very generous in opening its doors to me today, so I really do appreciate that. Before I get into slides and findings and those sorts of things, let me start off by trying to set some context for my remarks today. First, today my topic is digital readiness. It's a notion that is built on two things: skills and trust. Being digitally ready is about having the skills to use online applications, but also trust in new ways of carrying out tasks that require people to share a lot of information about themselves and about their households. It is also about people having the wherewithal to use new innovations, many which are enabled by data sharing and connected devices, and the possibility that many people won't have the wherewithal to get there as fast as many people in the public and private sector expect. Second bit of context, I've spent a good number of years helping policymakers understand the ins and outs of broadband adoption. Between my time at the Pew Research Center and then at the FCC working on the National Broadband Plan, my work has described who's online, who's not online, and why not. The shorthand phrase for this policy topic is the digital divide. My work and the work of many others has helped policymakers develop programs to get more people online. 3, as important as this work is and continues to be, the digital divide is about access to information and communications technology, and that's a field where the rate of change is extraordinarily rapid. At its core, the research I want to talk about today will discuss attempts to update the notion of the digital divide and put it in the context of rapid technological change and the skills that people need to have to keep up with that. Fourth point, framing is extraordinarily important to policy debates. The phrase, the digital divide, has been around for 2 decades at least, and invoking it often brings people back to those wonderful days of the Clinton administration. But it also may result in some of those people having their eyes glaze over, having heard the phrase digital divide maybe for too long. For me, it is still a worthwhile issue and an important issue to tackle. But the problem is diminishing. Today, I will argue that there's a new issue on the horizon, and that is digital readiness. Digital readiness encompasses the digital divide, but as I will argue, it is larger and more consequential. To make further progress on the digital divide calls for reframing the concept and giving it a new label. Finally, as I turn in a moment to presenting the research, let me say that this paper is probably best seen as a research essay. The research findings tell us something about the size and the nature of the digital readiness issue, and the paper also makes some policy recommendations. But the paper is best seen as an opening in a discussion and inquiry into this topic. By necessity, given the data that I have, this is really a 30,000-foot view at the issue of digital readiness. As new applications emerge, fueled by the Internet of Things, by big data, and more, we're going to have to continue to examine the issue of digital readiness in specific contexts, such as education, workforce development, and healthcare applications. And as we examine digital readiness in those contexts, we're going to have to think of ways and develop ways to make sure that everyone has the skills and trust in online applications to take full advantage of them. So let me turn now to the data. I covered this in my initial remarks, so I'm going to skip slide number 1. The second bullet point, though, warrants a little bit of attention. A motive for thinking about this topic is to ask the question, after the 2009 Recovery Act investments, are the main digital access problems solved, or have problems evolved, and if so, how? And I will argue that yes, they have evolved, and we have to take up the notion of digital readiness more forcefully. Let me start out with some data on the digital divide. It is declining. Come on. Let's look at some trend data. Since 2009, when we conducted a survey for the National Broadband Plan, broadband adoption at home has increased from 63% to the latest data has it about 72% according to the Pew Research Center, and also to data in 2012, I think, put together by NTIA. So the rate of home broadband adoption is closing as time passes. Overall, 85% of Americans are internet users. That doesn't just mean broadband at home. It could mean having access with a smartphone, using the internet at a library or a community center. Advanced online access is really changing the landscape when it comes to access to the internet. And according to data that I played with from the Pew Research Center, something on the order of 82% of Americans have either broadband at home or a smartphone. And I label access of that sort as advanced online access. And that's to say that if you have about 70% of the population online with broadband at home, when you add the roughly 12% of the population that has only a smartphone but not broadband access, you come up with this number of around 82% of people with advanced online access. Overall, then, the digital divide has narrowed from about 83 million adults without broadband in 2009 to on the order of 43 million lacking access today. Again, access defined as having advanced online access, namely including having smartphones. So that's a decline in the past 4 years of over 40% in the size of the digital divide. As I said, and I do want to emphasize, the digital divide does continue to warrant attention, especially among specific population segments, and you do see low rates of home broadband adoption among low-income people, among older Americans particularly, and pockets of lack of access in specific groups like families with school-aged children who are low-income as well. So clearly that work needs to continue. But I want to leave you with a message today that digital readiness is the emerging issue, defined there as a capacity for all users to engage with online resources with knowledge about their service attributes and the use of their personal and household data. The paper, which I have copies available for you, and if you can't get a copy, email me, which will be at the end of this presentation, and I can get you one, uses cluster analysis to estimate the size of the groups with different levels of digital skills. The cluster analysis is working on data gathered in a national survey in 2013 of 1,600 adult Americans. So I'll talk a little bit in just a moment about the inputs into the analysis that permits making statements about the size of different levels of Americans with different levels of digital readiness, but it's based on a national survey of Americans that's about a year old, which I conducted when I was at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. The cluster analysis is built on an index of inputs that you get from the questions asked of respondents. The first set of inputs has to do with knowledge of technology terms. And this is a method of trying to understand people's level of digital skills that I've adapted from Esther Hargitay, who's a professor of sociology at Northwestern University. And it asks people about their level of knowledge about various technology terms. I've listed them there: cookie, spyware, malware, app, refresh, reload, Wi-Fi, QR code. And what Esther did about 10 years ago was to use this technique to benchmark people's level of knowledge of terms, and then ask those same people to try to carry out a set of online activities, online tasks. And she found that by asking people their level of knowledge, that tracked very closely to the level of digital skills revealed when she asked them to try to complete specific online tasks. So it's a good way to measure people's digital skills without just asking them straight out, do you have high levels of digital skills? Because that kind of self-reporting can create some confounding aspects in the data. I did, for this purpose, nonetheless include some of those measures, self-reported measures, including self-reported comfort with computers, self-reported confidence in finding information online. So those are the inputs into the analysis, and out of the analysis comes different groupings of respondents, which I use to characterize the nature of people's digital readiness. And the paper finds that digital skills, or digital readiness, is not distributed evenly. Overall, when taking into account all adults in the survey, and in this survey, close to 85% of respondents were internet users, but when you take into account all respondents in the survey, 29% have low levels of digital readiness, 42% have moderately good levels of digital readiness, and 29% have fairly high levels of digital readiness. Demographically, those with low levels of digital readiness are older, lower income, and they have lower levels of educational attainment. I also explore the issue of digital readiness among the highly connected. The previous slide did include people who aren't internet users, but I wanted to explore what the size of the different population segments with different levels of digital readiness was among people who are highly connected. So this slide includes the roughly 4/5 of the survey who have advanced online access, either broadband at home or a smartphone. And you can see there that you still have a significant number, close to 1 in 5, highly connected individuals with low levels of digital readiness. Close to half have moderate levels of digital readiness, and then 36% have high levels of digital readiness. Now the table on the lower part of this slide goes into a quick analysis of the consequences of these varying levels of digital readiness. The survey asked respondents a series of questions of different things they had done online. Had they ever visited a government website? Had they used the internet in a job search? Had they ever taken a class online? And among people with advanced online access, you can see that for use of internet in job search, for instance, just 10% of those with low levels of digital readiness had used the internet in their most recent job search. By contrast, people with high levels of digital readiness were 5 times as likely to have used the internet in their most recent job search. Even people with medium levels of digital readiness were about 4 times more likely to use the internet in job search. Now, I had a slide up there before that pointed out the demographic groups with low levels of digital literacy, being older, lower income, lower level of educational attainment. Those of you who are very Sparky statistics students in college might be asking yourself right now, well, are low levels of digital readiness with the result that they're less likely to do various things online just associated with the fact that they're lower income, older, lower levels of educational attainment? Well, I ran the numbers, did some regression analysis, and in fact, the digital readiness effect is highly significant even when you control for those other factors that you might also suspect contribute to low levels of internet usage. So the digital readiness effect is robust when you control for other factors that are also likely to be associated with low levels of internet use. So digital readiness, specifically low levels of digital readiness, clearly translate into lower usage of the internet for various activities listed here, several of which are quite consequential: using the internet for job search, taking a class online, and visiting a government website. This slide starts to take the percentage numbers and puts it into estimates of how many millions of Americans are impacted by, fall into the different categories according to various attributes. So overall, you can see that 36 million Americans, roughly, adult Americans, do not use the internet. Compare that to the very bottom entry in the table, where we see that almost twice as many, or 70 million Americans, have low levels of digital skills. So from the get-go, you can see that having low levels of digital skills or low levels of digital readiness is a larger problem than people on the wrong side of the digital divide, the 36 million who do not use the internet. You can also see that the number of Americans with both low levels of digital readiness and advanced online access numbers approximately 33 million, which is on par with the number of Americans who, again, are on the wrong side of the digital divide. So you can see that as you start to look at these numbers, these estimates of millions of Americans falling into different categories, the share of Americans with low levels of digital readiness is much higher than those on the wrong side of the digital divide. And we have over 30 million Americans who have all the modern gear that most of us probably take for granted, but have low levels of readiness to really put those those gadgets to use on consequential applications. So I close out the paper with some policy implications. First, a threshold question in an issue like this is whether we really need to do anything at all. Digital readiness, as I've argued, is a sizable problem, but a threshold question to ask is it a problem of sufficient significance such that we really need to do something about it? In the paper, I argue that many of the next generation information and communications technology applications are public in nature. We hear a lot about digital resources in education these days. We hear a great deal about healthcare applications these days, and more government agencies are putting services online and using the internet to communicate with citizens. So all those investments in these public-oriented purposes have the expectation among investors in the public sector that in fact there will be payoffs to that, but the payoffs may be limited if you don't have a population that is significantly digitally ready to take advantage of them. So I suggest that government agencies engage in complementary investments in digital readiness to really take their investments in next generation applications truly the last mile to all Americans, to make sure that there's sufficient level of resources available for people to turn to figure out how to use some of these new applications. Next, the Internet of Things will be a series of applications that call for new levels of data sharing and trust for users. And I think it's very important to understand that the first wave of innovation in the Internet of Space really attacked a lot of transactional inefficiencies in various markets. The book market, the music market come right to mind. When you start to talk about the Internet of Things, you're talking about applications attacking inefficiencies on people's persons or in people's households. So you can imagine, you don't even have to imagine, home energy management systems that have connected appliances that help you manage your energy consumption in your home. More and more healthcare applications do or will soon have remote monitors placed on people's bodies to help send them messages about various aspects of their health. The upsides to those kinds of applications can be huge, but they require an enormous amount of sharing of data, personal and household data for individuals. And I think as some of these applications come online, it's reasonable to hypothesize at least that some set of users in society won't be ready to embrace those because of their wariness about sharing so much data with application providers. So finally, some policy. digital skills glitch. Some policy steps to promote digital readiness. One, I suggest leveraging existing programs that focus on the digital divide, such as Comcast Internet Essentials or BTOP programs. It would be one thing to say we need to do something about digital readiness and have that sort of statement just come out in a vacuum. But the fact is, over the past 4 years, we've had significant amounts of public and private investment in efforts to get more people online. I call this a broadband adoption infrastructure. My recommendation is that we leverage that infrastructure to work on the issue of digital readiness to provide people the resources and the knowledge resources to learn more about next generation applications and really use them. I suggest developing community tech champions for digital readiness. As a guy who used to be an avid bicycle commuter many years ago, I know that a lot of communities around the country have bike coordinators to help city officials basically do things to promote biking to work and also to not do things that might unintentionally discourage people from biking to work. I think that kind of role could be, or that kind of approach to technology on the community level could be very helpful by having champions for digital readiness at the community level, so that when governments start to do things to use next generation applications, there's somebody whispering in policymakers' ears that you need to think of these other steps to really make sure that the applications will be usable by a wide swath of the population. Next, I suggest investing in libraries. I don't know why I would bother to expand on that since Lara's on the panel, but tons of research from the Pew Research Center over the past several years has shown how important it is that libraries, it shows how libraries have become community tech hubs, providing resources for community members, not just for access to technology, but wherewithal on how to use it. So I think continuing to invest in that role for libraries is very important. And finally, engage the philanthropic community on the topic of digital readiness. I do think it's a sunrise topic and one that people who are interested in building civil society, civic society, need to be attuned to, and that's why I think the philanthropic community ought to be paying close attention to this topic of digital readiness. So with that, I will conclude and turn it over for Doug for a discussion. And again, my email's there. If you don't have a copy of the report and want one, I can get it to you. Thank you.
So yeah. So yeah, I was hoping that first we could just basically go down the line and get everyone's reaction and your own personal thoughts. Laura, if you want to take over. And
okay, would you like me to go up there or?
Up to you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
great. I'm Laura Breeden. I work at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which I'm sure all of you know is the President's Principal Advisor on Telecommunications and Information Policy. We also manage the spectrum allocation for the federal government. We're running the $7 billion FirstNet Public Safety Interoperability Program. We have an Office of Policy Analysis and Development, and we are the people that are handing the internet over to the Russians. So everybody got us placed now, and we are part of the Department of Commerce. So NTIA has actually been working on these issues for a long time. The first digital divide study was done in the mid-90s at NTIA, and I happened to be there then, which was really a great privilege, and it was a very interesting time to be there. I then left and came back when the Recovery Act program happened. And just a couple of words about that. The Recovery Act broadband program included $7.2 billion, $2.5 billion of which went to the Rural Utilities Service for build out in rural areas, highly rural areas, and about $4.7 billion of which stayed at NTIA. And of that, $450 million went to public computer centers and broadband adoption, and that's the piece of the program that I work on. So what I thought I would do is ask a series of questions and give you my opinion on them. And this is not NTIA policy. This is really where my thinking is currently. Although I'll try not to say anything that will get me in trouble beyond what I've already said. So the first question is, and John's answer to this question is yes, but is this a public interest issue? Why is there a public interest in making sure that people need to have the skills to go online and have access and are confident enough to go online and know what it means to be sharing their personal data online? I think it is, if only because more and more public services, public education, whether it's K-12 education or higher education, healthcare, the new health exchanges, unemployment, insurance, employment search, and so forth are moving online. Now, governments are very excited about this, and I was on a panel recently, or I was moderating it, and Blair Levin, who's at the back of the room now, said the federal government will be the last major enterprise that's running on dual platforms, and it will cost them billions of dollars. And that's because we have a substantial portion, as John has described, of the population who don't have the skills or the confidence, or in some cases the access. But I think NTIA's work bears out that there's a huge fear factor for people who haven't gone online, and it might be because of getting their personal information stolen. They've heard those stories, they've seen the movies. It might be because they don't think of themselves as smart people, and so they don't feel confident that they can learn something as hard as computers. But for whatever reason, and it's highly individual, that's one of the things that we learned in the process of working with all the projects on the ground, that people's reasons for not using the internet are quite specific, personal, and particular. And so it's a sort of high-touch proposition to get people over that initial hump. I'll tell you a quick example that came from one of our projects. The state of Ohio decided that everybody was going to need to be able to get their unemployment insurance and file online. And our folks in Ohio had some pretty good data on who was and wasn't online in Ohio. And when they brought this information to testify, I believe at the State House in Ohio, when they were considering adopting this law, it quickly became clear that a large, and obviously many of the unemployed are also people with lower literacy levels and lower economic attainment levels. They were not going to be able to go online and get their unemployment check or file for unemployment or look for a job because they didn't have those skills. And in fact, in some other states where the same approach had been tried, the state had been successfully sued on behalf of the people who didn't have skills. So it's not quite as straightforward as it might appear to be. And I would argue myself that there's also a very important civic issue going on here, with so much information about local government, about elections, about public services, about public education happening online. If people don't have the ability to use that kind of information and make judgments about it, then it really diminishes our democracy. My second question that I'll throw out is, what should the goals be? Should be everybody should have broadband at home? Is it everybody should have at least a smartphone? Is it something else? And I'm not prepared to answer that question, but I think when we talk about this, we don't want to be glib and assume that the problem is going to have an ultimate solution that looks exactly the same no matter where you are in the country and who you're talking to. I think so that's an important thing to keep in mind. The third thing I would say is an important question for us to ask is, who owns the problem? So NTIA got some money to do this, to make grants. We worked with really amazing for-profit and nonprofit organizations all over the country. We have more than 600,000 new broadband households as a result of these programs, which obviously is not going to solve the problem, but we've demonstrated that it can be done, and it can be done in public-private partnership. Is it up to NTIA to do the rest of the work? And if it is, who's going to pay for it? Or maybe the FCC. There's some FCC people here. Maybe the FCC could own this problem with their Lifeline reform and their Connect America fund. Maybe, the states, because they're the ones that are delivering these services directly to the populations, should be the ones. They're the ones that operate the health exchanges and the unemployment systems and the higher education systems. And finally, does anybody remember AOL? I'm old enough to remember AOL, like back when it was a service. It may exist as a web-based information platform now. I have no idea. Does anybody even know? Anyway, when you signed up for AOL, and anybody who was around then remembers this, you got a floppy disk. And then in a couple of months, they had another floppy disk. And pretty soon you had because this is how they marketed their service, floppy disks. But you had to pay for it. Today, if you want an email account, what do? Anyone?
Just go online.
Where do you get your email account? Gmail, right? Or Yahoo or whatever. So what's going on is Google just stupider than AOL, and they think they can give this thing away for free and it's not going to cost them anything, and there's some huge advantage. I mean, what is Google getting out of free email accounts? I think that's right. They're getting eyeballs, and once they have your email, they'll ask you what you want to have for lunch and where you want to go to the movies and so forth and so on. So I think this is a problem that touches so many spheres and that has so many consequences that we have to approach it together. And if you're a federal agency that's building an app, or you're a company that wants to sell an online service, the problem belongs to you as much as to everybody else. How am I doing on time? Am I over?
A little bit, but...
Okay, so I'm going to just say a couple more things. Solutions are available, and this is a toolkit that we did. We were smart enough to hire John Horrigan to help us, so that gave us even more credibility and wisdom than we would have had otherwise. But basically what this is those very particular techniques and ideas and approaches that worked on the ground in all these different populations that our grantees worked with. So there is, and John calls it a broadband adoption infrastructure, there is a lot out there to work with in terms of tools, curriculum, approaches, public outreach, etc. Connect to Compete is now involved in this. Internet Essentials, the Comcast offer, is still out there. Public libraries have really taken on a major role in training and access. And then a few things that we don't really have complete answers to that I think we would like to know. How do we measure the return on investment or the economic impact of this? So we've actually hired some people to do this, and they're producing a series of reports for us, which we're publishing on our website, and so we're getting some good data out of that. But it's a very hard problem, and any economist will tell you that. I don't think we really understand all the, I'm thinking of ancillary benefits to having people with these skills. So are people going to be, because they're more confident, more likely to try new things, more likely to learn new things? Are they going to have, because they have better access to information, make better decisions? I think there's a whole interesting cluster of questions around that. And finally, I'm really interested in how we can use popular media to kind of move the ball on this, because I think that there have been some really great movies that got at some of the issues around social media and networks, and some of them are scary and some of them are funny. But and then on television, you might have noticed that a lot of people are tweeting, especially if you watch The Big Bang Theory, or texting. So how could we use popular media to help advance the cause here? And with that, I will apologize for taking up more time than I should have.
It's all right. Laura.
Thank you, Doug.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Laura Clark. I'm with the American Library Association Office for Information Technology Policy. It is a thrill to be on this panel with these folks, many of whom ALA's worked with over time, and obviously the library community has benefited greatly with this investment from NTIA. And I've been a fan of John's for pretty much my entire time in the library community. OITP is the office focused on technology policy, not surprisingly, which includes everything from copyright and fair use to broadband deployment and network neutrality, and increasingly spectrum policy as well. And the ALA is the oldest and largest library association in the world with about 57,000 members. And we have a Washington office here and then headquarters in Chicago. I think it's going to be hard to disagree with John's points and the data that he brings forward. I guess I would say when I began working with libraries and started working on the Public Library Funding and Technology Access Study, when we were doing site visits, one of the very first visits that we made was in Las Vegas. And what we heard from the library there is that they had lines out the door waiting to get in. And it was about access, but it was about the skills. And it was about setting up email accounts. And it was because the largest employer that was getting ready to open a casino in Las Vegas was requiring all of their employees to go online to apply, whether that was a janitorial job or a landscaping job, whether or not it had anything to do with technology. Every single employee was going to have to go online. And many people had never done so and had never had a reason to go do so and didn't have anything from beginning to end as far as their ability to engage in this space. And that was about in 1996. So I think since the first computer was installed in a library, we've seen this issue play out for our patrons, that access does not alone magically equal digital success. So I think that's kind of our core message, and it fits very well with what John has talked about. It also jives with the recent Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development study, which talked about U.S. skills in relationship internationally around literacy and numeracy in a technology-rich environment. So I think there's a global competitiveness aspect of this, as well as going to the public interest question that Laura mentioned. I think that there's any number of reasons that everybody should care about this and share in the solution. Some of the other examples that I think, as far as if this is a question of the value, I mean, when you think about everything from Medicare Part D to how people are using mobile apps to manage their diabetes. These are the kinds of questions that we have in libraries, because people often turn to us, as they did in Las Vegas, as a point of need. So obviously we don't have to overcome the relevancy issue because it's immediately relevant to them right now, and it's often a crisis, whether that has to do with applying for work or applying for unemployment benefits, because many states have gone to this online-only environment where they say it's not online only, but you can't reach anybody by phone, nor can you make an in-person appointment. So even if they don't announce the fact, what we found in states across the country is that this is happening, and oftentimes where there's the most vulnerable populations, whether that's children and family services or healthcare issues, or trying to make an appointment with an immigration officer, where you can imagine the barriers are just compounded as far as literacy, English language, technology skills. So I think this is obviously important, and it's not a device. It's not only a device or software issue. We have had that as part of our conversation when libraries talk about digital literacy. What is it, and how will we know when we're digitally literate? I would say that this is a moving target, and it's a spectrum issue. As I think I also appreciate about John's work, that there's low, medium, and high. That there's not a single answer to, when is somebody digitally literate, and if you're digitally literate today, you will not be tomorrow. And I think we've all experienced that every time we download a new iOS or try a new application, that there's a ramp up factor, and that only is compounded when you think about any other barriers that may come into play. And I'm particularly stunned by the difference between the 10% at the low skills and then the 52% at the high skills, because I do not know, and I think this is a policy concern, and Nicole can probably talk about it even better than I can, that I do not know anybody who has not used the internet for their job search. And the idea that in this group of people who are connected through their access are not using the internet for their job search is something I can't even comprehend. I mean, how do you do that? Particularly when people who are bagging groceries are again needing to use the internet for that purpose. So, but I think another thing I appreciate is that this is also an issue around safety, security, and privacy, which are issues that libraries care deeply about as well, and are definitely barriers. The fear factor that Laura mentioned is incredibly important, and we see it, when we were in Alaska about online banking, where government checks may be being released, whether it's Social Security, as we see this move. You have to be, it's multiple layers. You have to have an online checking account, which many people don't. You might have heard about the money in the mattress. There are multiple levels that come into play with this. And also, we are saying that Web 2.0, this idea of creating is becoming a new competency as well. It's not just consuming. And this is something that I think libraries are already looking at, and it's a growing thing, and I think is part of what digital readiness will mean. That if you are tweeting in presidential debates, that is a part of digital inclusion. That is essential about our democracy and how it works. So we need to be thinking not just about consumption, but also about creation. And what will that mean for people to be truly engaged in the technology space? So I was trying to find if there was anything I did, have a quibble with John, and I guess he addressed it well around the digital divide issue, because I think that issue has not gone away. We find that it has not gone away, that we still have wait times for our computers and access, even as the Wi-Fi is growing. So more people are bringing their devices, but we still do have that issue. But I think John talked about it quite well, and for me, the only filter I would add onto that is about the compounding nature. That again, one barrier is enough, but when you add on several other layers, and we can't forget about print literacy, there are multiple levels at which we need to be thinking about these issues, particularly when it's not in our ecosystem, when we personally don't know anyone who doesn't have 3 devices, which we're seeing in our libraries, right? Like, I'll see somebody with their laptop, with their phone, and with their iPad, and they're using all of them in the library, but that's not the experience for everybody. I think the last thing I would say as far as my conclusion is that one of the concerns that I personally have is the speed of technology change means this gap can widen easily. So when we think about this digital divide and the chasm that exists, I just think of how hard I'm running to keep up with technology, and I'm pretty actively engaged in this space, and what does that mean for people who are further behind, and that the speed of change is actually widening that chasm all the time, and that is an urgent concern for all of us. That it's not a one-time or a static concern. And of course, I believe that libraries are smart investments for addressing this issue. That we have more than 16,400 buildings and communities across this country. That the role that we can play, particularly in rural communities, we may be the only place, and that's often what we hear from our libraries, as well as being in every neighborhood in larger cities. So there's a good infrastructure that's there, both in our space and with our staff, whose jobs are really about organizing information, as well as the technology infrastructure for computers and for the internet access. And there are current conversations happening that are relevant to this, whether that's E-rate program reform and having robust networks for public libraries in this country, or it's the Workforce Investment Act and acknowledging that libraries are serving as one-stop centers and are directly addressing digital readiness through this, and libraries should be eligible entities to receive support in order to build capacity. So that's about as fast as I can talk. So thank you very much.
Cool. I think they've said everything. My name is Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm with Minority Media and Telecom Council. So I want to thank John, I want to thank Doug and ITIF and my fellow colleagues for participating in this conversation, because everybody I think in this room has had a particular interest in the scholarship around public policy and broadband adoption and technology adoption. So John, I give you credit because you created a new term. I have to tell Larry Irving that we're trying to kick digital divide in the bucket, right? So we can talk about digital readiness. And it's interesting, like when I was reading the paper, and I've had a chance to look at an early version of this, if you think about the evolution of this whole conversation, right? We started with access, and then we went to digital divide, and then we went to content divide, and then we went to broadband adoption, and then we went to digital literacy. So here we are now talking about digital readiness, and what does that mean? And I think the research is particularly important because it gives us some forward thinking on how we're actually going to get more people to be engaged with this evolving internet, which I think is a really important conversation. I also think that the paper gets at with the concept of digital readiness, because at first when I read the paper, I said, well, why not digital literacy, right? This is an advanced discussion on digital literacy skills, that there's a level of intuitiveness that's implied in your paper of how people interact with technology. So I don't know about you, but I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they are more intuitive than I am when it comes to anything new and evolving in my household when it comes to technology. So I think this whole conversation around looking at people, even when they have access at home, and the extent to which they're ready to actually engage and how you break it down by demographics is a really interesting conversation. And it gives credence to this whole relevance argument that Pew and others and myself have actually talked about, the extent to which we have people that are not online because they've not determined the relevance of the technology, which is interesting because if you read the paper, there are people that actually have technology in their household. Now, when I was at a place called One Economy working this, we used to put computers in people's homes, and we knew when they weren't using it when it became a coffee table, and there was something on top of the PC. You know, we'd say, well, you know, we just put the PC in your home, you know what I'm talking about? And it's like got a drape over it or something, you know, and they've converted it into a piece of furniture. And so I think this is an interesting conversation from the standpoint of the degree to which people have technology, but they're not using it. So I think we've got to understand that, because it does mean, I think, to your point, that there's been more increase in access. On the other hand, I think the other thing that's really interesting is this correlation between, or this discussion that you have around digital readiness and the fact that people are accessing the internet in various ways, right? Whether it's mobile, PC, and with that comes another level of digital readiness. And I'll flip that argument with just some feedback on what that actually means. But I think that's also interesting the way you actually put that in there, because for those of us like, see, Francine, I'm not going to say been around for a while, who have talked about this, it's been a PC-related environment when we talk about digital literacy and skills, right? And so now we're actually looking at it where it's actually taking on mobile. And then finally, I want to just say, in just terms of why I'm excited about the paper, is this whole idea of public sector applications and the Internet of Things. And what will it take and what will it look like, again, for people to be very intuitive about those applications and have the skills needed to be able to use them in a way that allows them to increase capacity, individual or community good. And I think that's something, I think for all of us in this room as a public policy interest, we really want people to be digitally ready so that they can participate in the civic life that you discussed, and that they can take advantage. I mean, somebody, I think it was just mentioned, you asked me about, you know, I do read the paper. I've got my paper here. They do classifieds, and it's very interesting when you look at how people search for jobs. In some research we did earlier, a large number of low-income people went to the web to search for jobs. But according to research, it would also disentangle what jobs they were able to find based on the sophistication of how they, you know, knew how to use the internet. So I think that's also another nuance in this paper in terms of the public policy interests that we need to care when we're migrating towards telemedicine and educational resources. It's the savviness that's implied in the readiness that will make sure people go a little bit beyond the surface and actually can connect it into a transaction that works. Those are all the good things about paper. And John and I know each other for a long time, and I'm excited when I hear new stuff, and somewhat jealous because I'm like, oh, you're really smart about that one, right? But here's a couple of things, there's a couple of nits that I think are interesting to sort of think about in the paper. In this concept of digital readiness, I think that there should be a conversation around this interaction of all of these devices and the extent to which people are more digital ready on mobile versus a traditional PC environment, right? So I think that there's something to be said about that, particularly for communities of color that are over-indexing on mobile. You know, are they more ready when it comes to mobile devices to find that job? Are they more ready when it comes to interacting with social media? Will this device become the thing that really drives, you know, people's engagement with the technology more so? So I think that going a little deeper there would have been interesting, and to sort of lay out the different levels of digital skill that people need to actually engage. So is it, you know, going to a government website, does that require this level of digital skill versus, you know, gaming or doing something else require that level of digital skill. So I think that's a really important piece that I know scholars like myself would love to see the research sort of disentangle. I think the second thing is, and I'm going to say it, we still do have an adoption problem, and the digital divide is not going away, right? 43 million people, that's a lot of people. They can't fit in my house. Right? We're still talking about a big chunk of people that are not online. And I think that while we see that this is going to become the next stage of the issue or the challenge, we still have to make sure people have access. And so I don't want us to diminish that in terms of people. And I actually found your data interesting. Devin Hankerson and I were talking about this. We would love to see how the data actually blends African American low income, because the trajectory for African Americans in particular has gone up in terms of adoption, but we still know there's 28% of people that are not online, and a huge portion of them are undereducated, low income seniors. So it'd be good to kind of see how that lays out by demographic, because then we can kind of see the competing tension between access and readiness. And so if you could run those numbers, that would be great, because you have a pretty good sample size. And I'm not sure if you oversampled on African Americans if it's even possible. But I think that's important. I also think, and again, this kind of goes back to the intuitiveness, and I wrote this example down. It's like driving, and why I think the digital divide problem is still something that we need to work on. It's sort of like when you had a car. You remember when you learned how to drive, and then you took your driving lesson, and over time you just got better because intuitively you knew you had to stay in your lane or you hit a car. The challenge is if you don't have a car or you're not near good public transportation, you can't participate, right? And so I think, again, we still have to, even though intuitively people will, and I think your argument is, at some point, and Blair used to say this, at some point everybody's going to die off, and it won't be here, and it'll be the young people like my kids, right, that will do this as part of habit. But the question becomes, we still have to deal with the fact that people don't have the vehicle to get online. And I would just say the last point is I love the idea.
Actually, really Scott who used to say that.
Oh, was it Scott? I knew I was sitting next to him.
I was going to say it again in a few minutes.
I know it was between you and Blair that I've heard that everybody's going to die off and it ain't going to make a difference, right? Thanks a lot, right? But I think the last point that I think is really interesting, just for feedback, is I always believe, and I was glad you brought it up, that service delivery will be influenced by technology, right? So changing our service delivery systems, they have to be sensitive to that. While I'm skeptical that government will actually create websites that actually take into consideration the levels of which people enter, because the people who have developed them are not necessarily, they're IT specialists and not community people and tech champions. I want to go back to an earlier point, though. Probably before we do digital readiness, we need to trust readiness and make sure that these sites, and I think somebody said it, have not only the digital readiness, but a culture of trust that will help inform the use. And again, I think it would be interesting, for part 2 of the study, to sort of see how much digital readiness is driven by people's familiarity and trust of those resources. And I think that goes back to Laura's earlier point about the extent to which this is a public policy concern. Because I remember back in the days, people did not use technology because they thought Big Brother was watching. And there are people to this day that still feel that way. And so I don't know if it's going to be the way that we actually get government to be a little bit more sensitive to where people's entry points are, but also inspiring any new applications to think about what you talked about in terms of skills, but to embed this level of trust so that consumers can engage easier without feeling like I have the technology, but I'm not sure if this will benefit me or where my information will go. So good job, but that's my feedback. I know I'm sitting next to you, and we think alike on some things. I'm sure some things I've said. But thanks, John. Thanks, Doug.
I think that broke the rules a little bit. I have a PowerPoint. Which,
oh, you have a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so these are comments on John's new paper. First of all, I really like John's introduction with his sort of, I'm just a country lawyer. His exact words were, just an independent researcher trying to put some new ideas out there. And of course, he's been working on this, these sorts of issues for a long time. He's put all the ideas out there. Anyway, so we're, it's great to have a new paper from John. Let's see here. Where should I point this? Where's it going? There we go. Okay, so John starts off by pointing out that we've had the debates we've typically had in the past have been about broadband availability, but now we've pretty much got to the point where it's mostly everywhere available. We can argue, in fact, we do all the time about what sorts of speeds and so on we need, but basically, we've done that part of it. And then he goes on to talk about adoption, and that's another part of the debate. And he says, I guess the way I read it was that
we're making good progress. Not that there isn't a digital divide, but that the trend has been really in the right direction. And so we get a sort of a check minus on that because there's still work to do. But the thing that we want to focus on now is digital readiness, and this is the definition John comes up with. This is just the bumper sticker version, of course, because it's a little bit of a mouthful, this definition. The capacity for people to engage with online resources with full information about service, attributes, and use of personal and household data. And the headline number from this, of course, is that 70 million Americans have low digital readiness. That 70 million Americans are not digitally ready, right? Okay. So what I want to do is just sort of take a little look behind the numbers, and John talked about this too, and I'm pleased about that. Think about what digital readiness really means, and what can we do sort of going forward. Okay. Now, John said this, and it's worth putting this into figures from the information that's sort of in the appendix. He said that a lot of this has to do with education income. Well, you can really see that. This is divided. This is the share of people in each group by income. People who are high school education, at most of high school education, some college, and then more than college. And as you can see, the 63% of the people with low digital readiness have very little education, right? And 3% of the people with high digital readiness have little education, right? So you can see the big education effectiveness. So John mentioned this, but it's a big deal. There's something big going on there. And if you sort of turn that around and just look into this low digital readiness section in particular, what this says is that 44 million out of the 70 million people with low digital readiness have a high school education at most, right? That's a pretty big number where this group is concentrated. Now you see the same thing with income. It's slightly less pronounced, but you can see it that 42% of the people with low digital readiness earn less than $35,000 a year. 66% with high digital readiness earn more than $60,000. So you see the income effect there too. So the question is digital readiness mostly related to income and education? And if so, are digital literacy programs, and Nicole makes a good point about the difference between digital literacy and digital readiness, and I like the distinction, so I'm probably using the wrong word here, given the paper. But are programs targeted at digital readiness, will they be helpful if really it's an underlying factor about poverty? Now, John answered this a little bit. He said he did some regressions and that he found that the digital readiness factor still showed up to be significant. But I'm wondering, what was the dependent variable in those regressions, John?
Each of the 3 internet activities is binary logistic regression on the likelihood of doing either any of the 3 internet activities I listed on the slides.
Okay, the activities, not the things that form the index, right?
Correct. The activities, not
okay.
the form the index.
So that's good. And so then I would encourage John to include that in the paper, and also think about not just statistical significance, of course, but what's the magnitude of those effects when we think about that, right? Okay, now, and of course, also just to be glib, is this important because can we actually target these, or as the Onion puts it, is it just that it's bad to be poor, and these are underlying problems to do with poverty, right? I will leave that. Then the question is, what makes someone digitally literate, or digitally ready, I guess I should say. And so John creates this index based on several factors, whether people how familiar they are with an internet browser, spyware, malware, app refresh, real Wi-Fi QR code. And as he says, it's not really whether people know these things in particular that matters, right? I mean, not everybody knows what a QR code is. My mother has no idea what a QR code is, but she was still able in 1998 to talk to her students when she was abroad for a semester. When she was in Germany, she was able to talk to her students on the internet back here, 1998. She was able to figure out how to do that. It's pretty good. So she wouldn't pass this test, but she's still pretty digitally literate. Can't turn on the car radio, though. But as an index, though, there are a couple things. One is, we don't necessarily have to divide it into discrete categories, right? It could be a continuous variable, too. And the second is that just because you don't know these things doesn't necessarily mean that you're not digitally ready. It means that, at least from the way you described it, that there's a higher probability of your not being digitally ready, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that 70 million people aren't digitally ready. It means that this is some kind of indicator for people who don't sort of pass this test, that you might want to look at sort of other things to see what it is they can and can't do. I mean, perhaps this is a good diagnostic tool too for a person. I don't know if you've thought about it that way or not. So it's just another way to think about what this indicator really is that you're putting together and how it might be useful. And
Sometimes sort of waving it in different directions.
There we go. Okay. Well, I don't know what it's, but anyway. So then, when you go to digitally ready, some of the other data in the paper suggests that things might not be quite as bad. Right? 88% of the people said that they have used email. 77% said they were very or somewhat comfortable using a computer. 72% said they've used the internet on a cell phone or some other kind of mobile tablet. Now, as John says, these are self-reported, so you should take them with a grain of salt. But of course, the components of the index were also self-reported, so it's just got the same problem there. All right. Now, then, as I think either Laura or Laura said that digital readiness isn't the same thing for everybody, right? Different people need different skills. And those of us who are very familiar with Richard Scarry's Busy, Busy World know that people have all kinds of different skills and do different things during the day, right? And they need to know different things. And so, just for an example, going back to the data, like John said, a lot of the people who have low digital skills are also elderly people, right? And the things that they might want to know are going to be different than what other people want to know, right? Like maybe talking, emailing and using Skype to talk to their grandkids, or some who are want to enter the workforce might need something, re-enter the workforce needs something else. So these things are different for different people. And John said this, and in fact, somebody in the paper said this: one size fits all will not work. And of course, that was that guy who said that. So John is aware of this, right? And so what should we do finally? Well, I think first of all, this is a survey of inputs, right? Things that help make people that might make people digitally literate. And we also want to identify outcomes. What are these things supposed to help? And is there a way that we can measure them? And how do these different factors affect these outcomes? That's something we should focus on. So we tend to focus a lot on the inputs without thinking about what it is we really want. And we don't care about any of these things just for their own sake. We care about whether it helps someone get another job, whether it helps somebody learn something new. And we should evaluate existing programs. This is something we really don't do very often. How are participants chosen for programs? How does the program improve their skills? Do these skills lead to better life outcomes? And one of the problems is just an inherent problem with evaluations. Really, nobody should evaluate their own programs, right? Because nobody ever find that their own program didn't work. And if it's a proper evaluation, you have to be open to the possibility that it worked and it did great things, or that it didn't. And we rarely do that. We have very few truly independent evaluations of programs. But I just want to sum up that I think this is it's an important next step in what we learn about how our technological change affects people. We know that growing inequality is a huge problem, and the question is technology going to be just another symptom of growing inequality? That we have more haves and have-nots, or will technology be something that helps counter it, right? And I think underlying everything, that's what John is trying to get at, right? How do we make sure that technology benefits everybody? And that, I think, is an incredibly valuable path to go down. And so I'm very much looking forward to seeing more from John on this. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so I have totally failed at my job of keeping everyone within the time constraints, and so we're running kind of short on time. So and I'd like to at least get the opportunity for some audience questions. So for the sake of time, I've got 3 issues that I'm curious to hear more from the panelists, and so I will ask these 3 questions, and then anyone can jump in and address any parts of the wish. So first of all, I think incredibly important the fear factor. I think someone said this issue of trust as a component of digital readiness. What sort of policy levers do we have to affect people's level of trust, and how important is that as a particular component of these issues? Number 2, I think this issue of sort of a moving target of how the need of digital readiness changes over time, and the ease and ability of people to use various tools is an incredibly important point. I think it's absolutely true that, you know, as the economy and sort of as John points to, the Internet of Things, all sorts of things become digitized, it increases the complexity. At the same time, I think we've seen a tremendous increase in the ease of use for various applications. I mean, we don't have to be able to program a computer to be able to use it. And I think in the future, I mean, if we move towards everything being much more intuitive and easier to use, this could potentially change the need to address these particular issues. And number 3, kind of tying in with that, I'm really curious to hear people's reaction to Nicole's point on smartphones. I think we see radically different adoption rates for mobile devices, for smartphones and tablets, than we do for traditional computers. And I think this is tied into this issue of ease of use. It seems to me that the sort of application environment on smartphones, it's very easy to download a particular application and use, much more so than perhaps on a PC or something like that. At the same time, it seems like, to me, smartphones, at least now, are primarily a tool for entertainment, for social media, for music or video. And to what extent could adoption in the smartphone space be maybe an introduction, but not really address the core issues of digital readiness? So I just throw those out if anyone wants to, please.
Let me start out with the issue of trust and moving target by picking up on something Scott said toward the end of his, and I really appreciated all of Scott's comments. But the notion of evaluation and the need for it also tees up the possibility of a series of natural experiments that might unfold over the next couple of years on this. You see lots of interest in issues like this at the state and local level. You'll see varying levels of engagement in efforts to create more trusting environments for users as they engage with healthcare apps or local government apps. But you'll see also cities and communities who just don't have the resources or leadership to that engage on that issue. So I would suggest looking at how that unfolds and have a real evaluation plan in place to try to understand not only what works in terms of efforts to promote trust and an evolving notion of digital readiness, but then also see if those efforts actually bear fruit compared to places that don't really engage on this issue. So you'll have, I think, a chance for a natural experiment or the opportunities to even set them up to really give the evaluation points that I think Scott really hit on quite usefully, more life to them.
Anyone else reaction to any of these?
I'll chime in too. I think on the trust issue, well, the trust issue, I think definitely, right? That we have to kind of see if there's a layer of trust in the source and how it's written and how it's presented, that kind of stuff, the outputs that you talked about, that allow people who have lower skills to actually compete. And I mean, you said an interesting thing too about just the whole evolution of digital literacy training, right? Where you had to program a computer before and now you just basically pick it up. But I want to also go on Doug's thing about the whole smartphone. So it's really interesting. Like this last year, we talked about wireless devices and cell phones not being able to do a series of functions like, uploading your resume and doing things like that. And now this has gotten bigger and now it's a smart tablet, right? And we're still having the same conversation. So somebody needs to inform, are we in the right place? So let them know to build something that we can actually do those kinds of things. But I think it's interesting, this whole idea, though, of the device sort of evolving and that people picking up more on these devices, which I think in turn actually creates, again, a different level of intuitiveness when it comes to digital readiness. Because It does not. I mean, if you all remember when you had a PC in your home, how it was just so daunting to look at your PC and figure out. I mean, if you still have a PC at home, you still are kind of going through that every once in a while, trying to figure out, does this software work? Whereas you pick up your tablet, and there's so many things that you can do. And that's why I think it's really important with your research to sort of see where levels of adaptation are with smartphones to kind of go past, I think, the rhetoric that we talk about in our community. People are over-adopting. Well, what does that mean, right? What does that look like? Does that mean that people have different literacy skills and are much more ready to do more things on these devices that perhaps if we move it, I think that's your point, beyond, you know, watching Netflix to doing something like applying or finding jobs, or maybe they're using them to get to the job, right? But they're stopped with the application of the job. So, I mean, it's that kind of stuff I think is really important to be part of the discussion. Now, if you want to chime in too.
Yeah, first of all, I didn't know over-adoption was a phrase.
Well, yeah, I just made it up.
Oh, okay, it's a good one. Yeah, I mean, the question about changes over time and smartphones, of course, go together, because if we had been talking about this 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been about smartphones at all, but things have changed. Now we're talking about smartphones. And, you know, I think it's important for any policy just to also think about where the, sort of what are the underlying demand for goods and services, and if it's the case that poor and minority communities have adopted smartphones faster, then that's what you should be looking at in terms of where, if you want to make services available. And of course, it makes sense. We see it's poor families are more likely to be mobile phone only households, in part because they move more frequently. It's a big pain to have a landline, and the same is true for smartphones. So you can see that there's this demand for access to the internet and use of it, right? So they have smartphones, and so it sort of follows the same trend as mobile phones. And you know, the question about entertainment, you know, that's mostly what everybody uses their internet connection for right now. I mean, we like to talk about all these high-minded principles, but basically everyone watches Netflix, right? And other things. You know, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you know, that's what creates the demand for these things, for these devices. But so people have them, so then we can use them for other things too.
Mm-hmm. Audience, let's let the audience.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Anybody?
Can we move on to another question? So I'm a longtime member of the John Horrigan fan club. I would like to respectfully, and I love the concept of digital readiness, but I would like to respectfully ask you to rethink the definition. And I'm not saying in the library world, you know, we have multiple committees working over a couple of years. I think that was the digital literacy thing. And as I said, we have to use plain language. I would say normal people don't talk about service attributes. And I would also say, I don't know, when you talk about engaging with online resources, and I really think, like, we are the people who talk about this sort of thing. And I think we can come up with a better definition that's more robust. Because it's not just engaging with online resources, is it? We're talking about creating these things. And so I know, like, in work we're funding with tribal communities, we've had great success with one particular content management solution that has trust embedded in it. And so tribal communities that have not been big adopters are sort of rushing to get this Washington State University product. So I sort of throw that out there for you, John. I mean, I adore your work, but I've been I read this paper when it first came out, and I've heard you speak about it a couple of times now, and I've been uneasy because I think it needs something more.
Well, thanks, Mary Alice, and I'll definitely keep that in mind. I mean, this is version 1 of what I hope is an ongoing discussion. So, and I agree completely with the notion of content creation and the two-wayness of the internet having to have a role here. Just one small issue. This was a survey that asked a bunch of questions that happened not to go very deeply into the two-way aspect of the internet, but I think that specific point about the two-wayness and that having to be part of the equation in thinking about this is very good. So thank you, very helpful.
Yes, please.
So a question for John Horrigan. Have you broken out your data by households, and households was summed up by households rather than individuals, and households was 1 or 2 members who are literate, especially when you're dealing with elderly and immigrant families. Quite often, of course, you have one or two people who are literate and the other people use on that person.
I mean, that's a great point, and the answer is no. It was a survey of individuals, and you get one person in the household, and didn't have a chance to ask even about the nature of that household in terms of number of people in the household, and whether there was someone else in the household who's a digital expert. That's a great idea to bring into the what I hope will be next wave of research on this.
Let me also say that NTIA, since about 1994, has been doing this kind of research with the Census Bureau, and they actually have a lot of resources. But we work with them, and we pay them a fee, and we get to suggest questions. So I will be taking this back to our colleagues in the policy office when we talk about what is the next iteration of that. And we would be happy to take input from anybody who's interested in that. And the questions are public, and then we crunch all the data with the census folks and come up with our reports.
And I'd like to just circle back a little bit on the mobile thing, that we don't lose sight of the focus on the skills. I mean, we talked a little bit about outcomes. I mean, you talked, John, about applied uses of the technology, and regardless of the technology, whether that's an iPad, an iPhone, a computer, a laptop, I think keeping the focus on the skills piece, I think, is important. I mean, we talk about technology neutrality within infrastructure. I think that part of a question, knowing that there are differences, that there are real differences, but focusing on the skills and asking the question. The thing that I think is most important is that we always ask the question, and it's not just about the shiny object, it's about the skills to use that. And any time that we're talking about a new device or a new application, whether it's in the public domain or in the private, that we need to bear this question in mind. And I think that's fundamentally the thing that is most important to me about this, is this idea of digital readiness and having the skills and making sure that there's a component of whatever we're doing that we're talking about digital readiness, and we're keeping in mind particularly these compounding factors, that it's access and it's the skills. So I think we see this playing out all the time in the policy environment, and we do not see this in our own community. Like, often we do not see it personally, except maybe with our parents. So I think we have an obligation to bring this question forward anytime that any of our organizations or anybody that we're lobbying with is bearing this issue in mind, because it gets lost all the time.
I think we've got time for one more.
Just to ask a question, you made me think. You started off, John, saying this is sort of an issue that has a sunset period as people sort of become, more of the population becomes digitally ready. But just based on the discussion that you guys sort of been having after your presentation makes me think that, that there really isn't a sunset here, because we never really know what's coming on the horizon. And I wonder if you sort of thought about that just in writing, like, to what extent is this a sort of issue that does have a sunset? And, we can't really predict the future. And I think Scott mentioned it just a minute ago, like 10 years ago, we weren't really having a conversation about smartphones because they weren't here. And I think you mentioned the Internet of Things, and I think there is, everyone is sort of aware that, like, we can't predict what's coming, over the horizon. And to your point about skills, how much do we really understand how much the skills need will change as either the device landscape changes or the integratedness of technology in our lives sort of gets ratcheted up, like, a couple of notches?
My quick response to the time horizon for sunsetting this issue is, I don't know what the exact time horizon is. I think it's longer than some people in the tech industry would suspect. And what the dimensions of any of that is, I don't know. But I do think, because we still are in a rapid era of technological change, that there will be the need for resources to help people be digitally ready. And as I was glad Scott not only put my picture up there, that was really cool, but also my, one size doesn't fit all point within the paper, which is, I do think there is a public and private dimension to it. I think the private sector can do a lot to tackle this issue, and I put in some historical examples in the paper of how that's happened in the past with the private sector, helping people adapt to technological change. Public-private partnerships, I do think, will be key, but I think it's going to be with us for a little while at least. How long? Don't know.
But are the skills going to change? Is my question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the skills will change because the technology is going to change.
I was just going to say, just really quick to your point, because you bring up an interesting point, Devin, about the sunset period. I think what's interesting about the paper too, and through your graph, the fact that higher income people actually have such higher levels of digital skill and the lower income people don't, it scares me a little bit because it could become the next variable for not necessarily a digital divide, but a divisive measure that sort of slows down first-class digital citizenship for lower income, less educated, more remote people. So I think that at some point, and I think this goes back to why are we talking about this in Washington, D.C., there is a discussion, and we've seen a lot of it with the NTIA projects, the extent to which you can close or narrow some of the gaps that comes when people actually do begin to engage in this ecosystem, that they're not left behind. And I think that's a really poignant point that maybe goes back to the areas, but it's bringing that out more in the paper lets folks like us know that this is something that we need to look forward to because it's the other side of history.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I want to bring it out in the next papers because this couldn't cover all that ground, but I agree completely that to embed these issues and issues of basic literacy, economic inequality, other things is crucially important.
Also, I think that's it's a really interesting question too. Yeah, the one you just asked a second ago. Sorry, because obviously nobody has any idea what we'll need to know in the future. But you can imagine things changing in such a way that there's always this gap of people over 65 who don't know because I know how to use my smartphone now, and maybe I'll never learn anything else. But maybe it'll be more like cars. You get the example of automobiles, right? If in 1900 you needed to know how to fix your car, or you wouldn't be able to drive it. But now all you need to know how to do is use a key. And so it all depends which way is it going to go, right?
Or not, right? You could just use that button.
But how do I change?
Well, actually,
how do I change the clock when daylight's in?
That's a good question.
All right, with that, well, thank you guys. Thank you, panelists, all for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.
Appreciate it a lot.